이 사과. 여러분들은 지금까지 이 사과를 몇 번이나 봤어요? 1000번? 10,000번? 100,000번? 틀렸어요. 여러분들은 지금까지 이 사과를 한 번도 본 적이 없어요. 그러니까 시를 쓰기 위해서는 잘 봐야 돼요. 우리가 살아가는데 제일 중요한 것은 보는 거예요. 본다. 보는 거죠. 우리는 뭐든지 보고 살잖아요. 네, 세상의 모든 것을 잘 보는 것이 중요해요.
Director Lee Chang-Dong said in an interview that he wanted to make films that make people observe the world with different eyes, to feel invisible beauty, and to question life. Poetry is a film that is about more than just poems. It's a film about seeing and feeling the world around us differently. And as I'll explore in this visual essay, poetry provides us with a method of filmmaking that disempowers hegemonic ways of looking. Lee provides us with an example of filmmaking through a decolonising lens. If decolonisation bears the aim of challenging the legacies of force and domination, and filmmaking is concerned with the representation of stories and identities, then an ethos of decolonisation can manifest via films that encourage us as viewers to look deeply and differently at the world around us and its structures of power. Mija, a 66-year-old woman, is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She lives with her teenage grandson and does care work for an elderly disabled man to earn some extra money. Mija also joins a poetry class in order to fulfill her one goal, to write a poem. After poetry class one day, Mija is brought into a parental meeting where she learns that her grandson and 5 of his friends had been raping their female classmate over 6 months, which drove her to kill herself by jumping from a bridge into a river.
죽어내도 죽어내지만 안 됐지만 이제 우리 애들 어떻게 할 것인가 고민해야 될 때고 그래서 이렇게 한자리에 모이자고 한 겁니다.
The fathers of the boys involved discuss how they can hide the incident from the press and give financial compensation to the family of the deceased girl, who I will refer to by her name as Hee-jin from this point on. For the rest of the film, we share in Mija's experience of coming to terms with her grandson's actions and feeling the deepest sympathy for Hee-jin through immersing herself in the experience of writing poetry. In the film, there is no musical soundtrack, which becomes clear when the end credits roll to the sound of a river flowing. There is no attempt by the director at manipulating our emotions through music. The sound of leaves rustling and water flowing provides a background to the film instead. In this way, the space of poetry allows us to pause, reflect, and surrender ourselves to a situation, rather than being pulled into a cycle of melodrama. There is a lack of sentimentality in Lee's filmmaking. He witnesses complexity and does not try to simplify it. As he stated, "I pictured the film to have much space as poems do, blanks that the audience could fill in. In that sense, it can be seen as an open film. The conclusion will be in the audience's mind." The quality of space brings us perspective. It is also one of the requirements of effective listening, something that is key to moving beyond colonial ways of being. Lee's framing of the film around space also engenders contemplation, much like a poem does. Just as a minute's silence creates the space for the acknowledgement and contemplation of the suffering of others, representing a film with space encourages us to witness awkward and uncomfortable emotions that arise when we are faced with problematic issues. We, as the audience, are encouraged by the film's style to witness the issues that the characters of this film actively ignore. At the film's start, Mija says that an old high school teacher of hers told her that she would one day become a poet.
내가 원래 굿즈하고 가끔 이상한 소리 잘한다고.
However, we learn that there is a lot more to poetry than wordplay and admiring the beauty of flowers. Lee shows us that true poetry and true beauty lies in seeing and feeling a situation deeply and differently. Perhaps this is why one of the poets in the film says that poetry is dying. Poetry has lost its relevance in a society that has lost touch with its emotions and empathy. Flowers and fruit are both conventional subjects of poetry, and they appear throughout the film's mise-en-scène at meaningful moments, used as symbolic motifs as a way of encouraging us to look deeply. In this way, the film resembles a poem itself. At the start of the film, a funeral bouquet passes in the background as Hee-jin's mother collapses to the floor in shock at learning the news of her daughter's suicide. At the film's end, white flowers are left on the teacher's desk, along with Mija's final poem. During the scene where Mija learns of the news of her grandson's involvement with Hee-jin's sexual assault, the fathers of the boys pragmatically discuss how they are going to protect the reputation and future of their sons. There is almost no remorse for Hee-jin's experience. Mija leaves the room to observe some red flowers outside.
참 개념 없는 할머니네. 지금 상황이 뭔 상황인데 저러고 있나 그래? 우리 할머니 지쓰고 계지?
그냥 메모. 항상 이렇게 메모를 해야 한대요.
뭐라고 쓰셨는데?
피같이 붉은 꽃이라고요.
In another scene, when Mija tells her doctor that she is studying poetry, she explains the colour of flowers and their poetic symbolism.
겨울의 꽃, 붉은 고통의 꽃.
동백꽃이 고통의 꽃이에요?
네, 꽃 중에서 붉은 것은 고통이거든요. 흰 꽃은 순결.
저거 좋아해요.
If red symbolises pain, then the appearance of red flowers throughout the film signifies the rising grief that Mija feels after learning the news of her grandson's actions.
우리를 지켜주는 방패.
Red flowers even provided the backdrop for an interview that the director gave on this film. As Lee once said, art is a pursuit for beauty, and there is the question of how it is related to the filth and vice of the world. The question is similar to what Theodor Adorno had asked. Is it possible to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz? The character Mija in the film asked those questions instead of me. Mija's Alzheimer's diagnosis perhaps signifies her as a metaphor for our relationship with memory and the past, how we can face and understand human rights issues and the voices of people who experience subjugation. Mija's pursuit of poetry is ultimately born out of her response to the actions of her grandson and his 5 friends. In this way, poetry becomes a way of transmuting the filth and vice of the world into something deeper and transformative. One of the key themes that emerges in Lee's film is beauty and its relation to ephemerality. Poetry becomes a means of connecting with and capturing beauty without trying to seize it or take it by force. This is perhaps best encapsulated in the scene when Mija engages in small talk with Hee-jin's mother.
날씨가 도와주네요.
여기 참 좋은 곳인 것 같아요. 경치도 너무 좋고 걸어오다가 살구도 주웠어요. 살구가 땅에 막 떨어져 있어요. 한 입 깨물었더니 맛있더라고요.
This scene in poetry reminds me of the painting by Kang Duk-kyung, who was a survivor of the systematic sexual violence perpetrated against girls and women in East Asia during the Second World War by the Japanese Imperial Army.
한 입 깨물었더니 맛있더라고요.
살구는 원래 땅에 떨어져 있는 게 맛있어요. 나무에 달려 있는 거 떨궈서 못 먹어요.
네, 그 말이 맞더라고요. 맛있어요. 아까 살구가 땅에 떨어진 걸 보고 참 간절하다고 생각했어요. 지 몸을 땅에 던져서 지 몸을 맞게 해주고 밟히게 해서 다음 생을 준비하잖아요.
This conversation is about more than just apricots. It's about consent. Under a colonial logic, girls and women are not seen as people, but as exploitable and disposable bodies in the colonizing process.
제가 희진이 담임선생님한테 절대 단도를 해뒀거든요. 아이들 장래도 그렇고 학교가 난리가 난다고. 그러니까 여러분들도 절대 말이 새지 않도록 해야 합니다.
Just as Hee-jin was seen as an unfortunate but necessarily violable body at the hands of a group of boys, so too has this historic issue reflected the underlying patriarchal structures of both Korean and Japanese society, as an issue that was discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors, with financial compensation being used in lieu of an apology. Although Poetry is not a film that is based on the subject of colonisation, the film is nevertheless rooted in its representation of society's attitudes towards women's and girls' bodies that reflects a colonial logic. When approaching subject matter like this, we might reflect on Lee's decision not to represent the actual act of the abuse. Instead, he represents people's responses to this event. The camera does not objectify Mija, nor does it objectify Hee-jin. I became interested in the ways in which we might represent issues of sexual violence through film. We need not focus on re-envisioning the traumas themselves, and in effect re-empowering them. Instead, we need to find other ways of addressing them, casting the gaze back on those who were implicated. This is why Hee-jin's look at the end of the film is so important. As Mija's trajectory becomes increasingly paralleled with Hee-jin's, so too does Mija's grandson become paralleled with the elderly man she cares for. One day, the man solicits her for sex after taking Viagra. Mija refuses and quits her job on the spot. Throughout the film, we see Mija take responsibility for her grandson's actions by attempting to understand the perspective and experiences of Hee-jin. She visits the science lab in which the abuse happened. She attends Hee-jin's eulogy. Later on, Mija visits the bridge where Hee-jin jumped, and a gust of wind blows her hat from her head into the river below, like a petal falling from a flower. Following her visit to the bridge, Mija returns to the house of the man she cares for and has sex with him. We may interpret this as an attempt to make penance for her grandson's actions and to empathise with Hee-jin. Later on, when Mija has to pay compensation money to Hee-jin's mother, she returns to the man's house and requests that he pay her. The book that has been used to write down her words and inspiration for poetry becomes a bargaining tool to receive the money to pay compensation. Poetry is ultimately about accountability, attempting to understand and feel from the perspective of those who have been deeply wronged, and casting a critical gaze over the system of ideologies that permits this to happen, looking at ourselves and our own responsibility and positionality in relation to these matters, which is what lends it so well to a discussion of decolonisation. Poetry is a film that encourages us to see the world differently. To see well is a fundamental aspect in writing poetry or making films. Films show the world on behalf of the audience's eyes. However, the films that we make, what kind of eyes are they in showing the world to the audience? Some films make us see the world differently, while some make us see only what we want to see. And some films do not let us see anything. Lee's style of filmmaking encourages us to look and see the details that would otherwise go unacknowledged.
뭐 보고 있어요?
나무요.
나무는 왜 봐?
나무를 잘 보려고요. 나무를 보고 느끼고 나무가 무슨 생각을 하나 내게 무슨 말을 거나 들어보려고요.
When approaching filmmaking and analysis, we might consider the ways of looking that films are designed to encourage, and search for those films that allow us to see the world differently.